They said it so casually, as if I were an intruder or a beggar who had wandered in from the street. Don't hand her anything. The words came from my own son's mouth, shaped with that dry authority he likes to use in front of people he wants to impress, clipped and final, the way you would dismiss a stranger. He didn't even look at me when he said it. He looked at the lawyer, as though I were not present, as though I were a shadow cast on the chair and nothing more. The lawyer's pen hesitated in the air for a fraction of a second. His eyes flickered between my son and me, but the silence that followed was heavy and decisive. That was the moment when the ground beneath my feet shifted, when I understood that the man I raised, the boy I once bathed and fed, the child I had walked to school and worried over during fevers, had grown into someone who could publicly deny me even the dignity of acknowledgement. I am 79 years old, my body slower, my bones weaker, but my memory is sharp, and I will not forget the sting of those words in that paneled room with its polished table and the scent of polished leather, where the echo of my husband's absence was already too much to bear. I sat still, my hands folded on my lap, and I reminded myself not to tremble, not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing my hurt spill out, because they were already ready to say that I was fragile, confused, or prone to dramatics. That is the oldest trick, to turn a woman's pain into proof of her instability. I swallowed, tasted the dryness in my throat, and kept my gaze on the brass key lying on the table, its metal catching the light, small and ordinary, yet suddenly the only solid thing in the room. That key, which the lawyer had mentioned, would be addressed at the end of the will, the one piece of Derek's life that my son had no knowledge of, no hold on, no control over. My Derek, gone now 3 months, had left me a secret in plain sight, and though I did not yet know what was inside the safe deposit box it opened, I knew instinctively that it would matter, that he had thought of me at the end, that he had given me more than the polite condolences, the hushed voices, and the carefully choreographed pity I had been receiving since the funeral. You see, I was not always this invisible. There was a time when I was central to the household, when no meal was served unless I had cooked it, when no bill was paid unless I had balanced the accounts, when no one left the house without me checking if they had eaten, if their collars were straight, if their shoes were tied. I kept that house afloat with my hands, with my back, with the money I earned in small jobs and the money I saved by patching clothes, by stretching meals, by refusing myself luxuries. Derek used to say that I was the true foundation, the one no one saw because foundations are supposed to be hidden, but without which the house collapses. He meant it as a compliment. But the trouble with foundations is that people forget to thank them, and eventually they forget they exist at all. When Derek was alive, at least he remembered. At least he would hold my hand at the end of the day and tell me that he knew, that he saw, that he had not been blind to my sacrifices. Now he is gone, and the silence in my own house has become unbearable, because my son and his wife have turned it into a showroom, a stage where I am an unwanted prop. On the morning of the will reading, I had dressed carefully, in the navy dress Derek always liked. The one he said made me look like I carried the ocean with me. I pinned my hair the way I used to when we went to church. I polished my shoes, though the leather is cracked, and I put on the pearl earrings he gave me for our 25th anniversary. I told myself I would sit quietly, that I would not speak unless spoken to, that I would honor Derek by maintaining dignity even if they tried to rattle me. But I did not expect that my own son would deny me openly, would say to the lawyer and to the 2 witnesses, one of them a cousin who avoided my eyes, that nothing should be handed to me, as if I were not the rightful wife, as if I were already dead, as if I had no claim. That was more than cruelty. It was erasure, and erasure is a kind of murder of the soul. I thought of all the times Derek and I had discussed mortality, quietly, in bed after the lights were out. He always said that he feared not the end itself, but the way our children might behave when we were no longer there to guide them. He had a sharp instinct for people, sharper than mine. I remember him once saying, almost offhand, "Adam is proud, dangerously so. He will one day confuse pride with strength, and pride is brittle. Be careful, Martha, when I am gone, because brittle things cut deepest when they shatter." I had laughed then, dismissing his worry, thinking it was just the somber talk of age. But as I sat in that office, listening to my son's clipped tone, seeing the way he leaned back in his chair as though to distance himself from me, I realized Derek had been right. Pride had turned Adam into a stranger. The lawyer cleared his throat, smoothed the pages of the will, and read the lines Derek had written months before his final illness. I listened, my ears straining for Derek's voice behind the lawyer's monotone. There were the usual bequests, small sums to grandchildren, a watch to a nephew, some tools to a neighbor. My son and his wife were to inherit the house. That was no surprise. Derek had always said he wanted the family to have stability. But then came the final clause, the one Adam had not anticipated, the one that made his jaw tighten, a safe deposit box, in my name alone, key to be delivered directly to me. The lawyer reached for the key on the table, the brass glinting between his fingers, and it was at that moment Adam spoke his poisoned line, "Don't hand her anything." His wife nodded almost imperceptibly, complicit in the performance. I cannot describe to you the cold that settled over me then. It was not the cold of grief, not the cold of fear, but something else, something harder, the cold of recognition, of finally seeing the truth of your child's heart. It is a cold that settles into the marrow and stiffens you, makes you realize that there are betrayals worse than any stranger's insult, because they come from the very blood you carried inside you once. I felt the weight of my 79 years pressing on me, not as weakness, but as history, as proof that I had endured too much to bow my head now. I looked at the lawyer and I did not say a word. I simply extended my hand, steady and unflinching, until he placed the key into it. I closed my fist around the metal, felt its ridges bite into my palm, and I knew then that Derek had left me not just a key to a box, but a key to myself, to a part of me that had been smothered by decades of obedience, compromise, and the desperate need to be loved by those who clearly valued me only in silence. When the reading was over, Adam stood without meeting my eyes, spoke briskly of errands, of schedules, of matters to be handled. He wanted to move quickly, to sweep me out of the room like dust after a gathering, but I stayed seated for a moment longer, listening to the clock tick on the wall, the sound echoing like a heartbeat in a tomb. I thought of Derek's laugh, the deep rumble that used to fill our kitchen, and I thought of the nights when he would sit at the table long after everyone else had gone to bed, writing letters, balancing ledgers, sometimes scribbling notes he never explained. It must have been during those hours that he arranged the box, that he decided to leave me something only mine. The thought gave me a strange, steady comfort. So here I am now, in a house that no longer feels like mine, in a family that treats me like a guest who has overstayed her welcome, holding a key that I do not yet fully understand, but that already feels like a lifeline. I am 79 years old. I live alone in the house where my husband once lived beside me, though his son now circles it like a hawk. I have been many things in my life: daughter, wife, mother, nursemaid, accountant, cook, caretaker of everyone else's needs. But at this moment, after that brutal morning in the lawyer's office, I feel like something else entirely. I feel like a woman on the edge of a discovery, a woman holding the first thread that might unravel the fabric of all the lies and erasures. A.E., woman who has been denied everything except the one thing that may, in the end, matter most. And that is where my story truly begins. The moment the lawyer's voice steadied and he read aloud the final clause that Derek had written in his own hand, a hush filled the room that was thicker than silence, the kind of hush that feels like it has weight and temperature, pressing down on your shoulders until you can barely draw breath. He announced that a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of the bank had been left in my name alone, that a key had been entrusted to me, and that no one else was to interfere in the matter, not my son, not his wife, not any relative, no matter how they might argue or protest. For a second, the words floated in the air like dust caught in a sunbeam, fragile and almost invisible, until Adam snapped them down with a sharp shake of his head, his jaw set in a way I had not seen since he was a sulky boy refusing to apologize. After breaking a neighbor's window, he said again, more forcefully this time, "Don't hand her anything," as though volume could erase legality, as though the force of his disdain could override Derek's wishes. But the lawyer, perhaps sensing that something larger was unfolding, something that might later demand testimony or justification, ignored Adam's order and passed the key across the table into my hand. I remember the coolness of the brass against my skin and the faint sound it made when I closed my fingers around it, a sound so small that no one else probably noticed. Yet to me, it was louder than my own heartbeat, louder than the clock ticking on, the paneled wall, louder than the shuffle of papers and the scrape of chairs. In that instant, the roles shifted without anyone naming it aloud. Adam thought himself the master of the room, the heir, the authority. But Derek's hand reached across time to place me at the center instead. And though Adam glared and Carla's mouth tightened in that thin line she uses when she wants to look, composed while boiling inside, neither of them could undo it. I glanced at their faces and saw the truth unmasked for a flicker of a second. Not grief, not love, not respect, but panic. Panic that something they had counted on, perhaps already planned for, was slipping beyond their grasp. Panic that Derek had not trusted them fully, that in his final days he had chosen me, the old woman they treated as inconvenient, as diminished, as easily silenced, over them with all their ambition and polish. That panic was my first real taste of freedom since his funeral, because in their fear I saw my power, small as it might be, returning to me like a bird that had flown too far but knew the way home. The catalyst was not the key itself, but the realization of what it represented. Derek had not left me money outright. That much was clear from the earlier passages of the will, where Adam's name and Carla's were repeated with property, with accounts, with the house itself. No, what Derek had left me was different, subtler, more dangerous, a pocket of autonomy, a secret that only I could open, a container of something that could not be touched without me. He knew Adam's hunger for control. He knew Carla's hunger for appearances, and he knew they would try to fold me into their narrative as the grateful old matriarch who smiles from the corner while the younger generation steers the ship. Derek, even in death, refused to let that be my ending. I walked out of the lawyer's office with the key in my coat pocket, feeling its weight with every step, as if the fabric itself strained under it. Adam walked beside me, his voice low and tight, telling me that there was no need for me to trouble myself with such matters, that he and Carla would take care of the bank, of the papers, of the details. I let him speak, listening to the rehearsed concern in his tone, the way he tried to make it sound like kindness, like protection, while all I could hear was possession. He said, "You shouldn't stress yourself, Mom, not at your age. These things are complicated. You could misunderstand something, and then it will just create problems." He did not see that with every word he pushed me further from him, because I knew the truth. Complications did not frighten me, but his eagerness did. That evening, back at the house that once felt like mine, I sat alone in the living room while Adam and Carla whispered in the kitchen. I could hear their voices, muffled but tense, the quick rise and fall of syllables, the pauses where one of them must have gestured or frowned. They thought they were being discreet, but walls do not lie. They carry sound, and I understood enough. They were plotting how to handle me, how to minimize my access, how to present a unified front. Carla said at one point, louder than she intended, "She'll lose the key. It's only a matter of time. We just need to wait her out." Adam hushed her, but it was too late. The words had already seeped into my bones. Wait me out, as though I were a storm to be endured, as though my own life were nothing more than an inconvenience that would soon end. I sat with Derek's photograph in my lap, the one from our 50th anniversary, when his hair had turned entirely silver, and his eyes were still lit with that mischievous glint that made me feel like a girl again. I traced his face with my finger and whispered to him that I would not be erased, not like this, not by the people we brought into the world together. The catalyst was not their betrayal alone. It was my awakening, my sudden clarity that I had allowed myself to shrink for too long, that I had accepted invisibility as the price of harmony, that I had traded my own dignity for the comfort of those who now denied me even a sliver of respect. That could not stand. The following morning I rose early, earlier than Adam and Carla, who slept late after their wine. I dressed in my warm coat, the one with the deep pockets, and I slipped the key inside. I told them I was going for a walk just to clear my head, and Adam mumbled something about not straining myself. I walked instead to the bank, each step heavy with anticipation and fear, not of what I might find, but of the possibility that there would be nothing at all, that Derek had left me only the illusion of power. Yet even that fear could not stop me, because the very act of walking there on my own terms felt like defiance, like proof that I still had choices left to make. When I stood before the teller and presented the key, I half expected her to shake her head, to tell me there was some error, some missing paper, some obstacle. But she simply nodded, escorted me to a small room with a table and a chair, and brought me the box. My hands shook as I fitted the key into the lock, but it turned smoothly, and the lid opened with a soft metallic sigh, as though Derek himself had been holding his breath for me. Inside were documents, yes, but also letters and photographs, and something wrapped carefully in cloth. I did not touch them all at once. I simply stared, the relief flooding through me in waves, because whatever was inside, it was mine. It was his final word to me, and it was beyond Adam's reach. That was the true catalyst, the realization that even in the shadow of death, Derek had seen me, remembered me, and given me the means to see myself again. When I walked back from the bank that day, the streets looked different, sharper, more alive, as though I had been sleepwalking for years and only just now woken up. The betrayal of my son was no longer the whole story. It was only the spark. The real story was that I, a woman nearly 8 decades old, had been handed back a piece of myself that I thought had been buried with my husband. And no matter what storm Adam and Carla might try to summon, I would not give it back. When I returned from the bank that morning, carrying the weight of the unopened letters and the still-wrapped bundle in my bag, I thought perhaps I could keep my secret safe for a while, that I might slip quietly into a rhythm of solitude, reading Derek's words in the silence of my room, drawing strength from them in private. But secrets do not remain hidden long in a house where distrust already breathes in the walls. Adam sensed something before I had even removed my coat. He looked at me with that narrowed suspicion he once reserved for classmates he thought had cheated him, and he asked too casually if I had enjoyed my little walk. I nodded, careful not to let my voice shake, and said that the air had done me good, that I had stopped by the church to light a candle. He did not believe me. I could see it in the way his eyes flicked toward my hands, searching for evidence, as if I were a thief returning from some forbidden errand. Carla, with her endless talent for polite cruelty, merely smiled thinly and said that I ought to be careful not to overexert myself, that I had seemed unsteady lately, and then she placed her hand on Adam's arm in that rehearsed way of hers, as though she were calming him, when in truth she was feeding his doubts. That evening they began to tighten the leash in ways so small that an outsider might not even notice. At dinner, Adam served me a smaller portion than everyone else and remarked that at my age I should be watching my diet, as if he were the authority on my body, as if I had not raised him through lean years when food was scarce and portions were measured carefully only because I chose to eat less so he could eat more. Carla insisted on keeping my medications in a neat little plastic organizer on the kitchen counter, saying she wanted to make sure I didn't forget, though I had never once in my life forgotten my prescriptions. She began moving Derek's things out of sight under the guise of decluttering, telling me that dusty books and worn jackets made the house feel dreary. Every day some trace of him vanished, a pipe, a pair of glasses, an old sweater that still smelled faintly of cedar, and when I asked where she had put them, she would tilt her head and say she wasn't sure. Perhaps Adam had donated them. Bit by bit, Derek's presence was being erased, and with it my claim to the years we built together. In conversations with neighbors, I noticed subtle shifts, hesitations in their greetings, glances exchanged behind my back. One kind woman asked if I was managing all right on my own, though she knew very well that I lived in the same house as my son. Another remarked on how lucky I was to have Adam and Carla taking such good care of me. Her tone just slightly too sweet, the kind of sweetness that covers doubt. I realized then that Adam had begun to plant seeds in the community, whispering about my supposed frailty, about the possibility of confusion, about how difficult it was to manage an aging parent who sometimes lost her way. He wanted to build a case before I even opened my mouth, so that any protest of mine could be dismissed as paranoia. It was a clever cruelty, because once people believe a woman is slipping, every word she utters becomes suspect. At night, in the guest room they insisted I use, even though half the closets in the master bedroom were still filled with my clothes, I would take out Derek's letters one by one and read them slowly, his handwriting looping across the paper with the steadiness of a man who never rushed his thoughts. Some were love letters written years ago that he must have kept for himself. Some were notes he had written in the final months of his illness when the morphine blurred his days. But all of them contained the same thread of recognition. He saw me. He trusted me. He knew I would need proof when others tried to make me doubt my own worth. That was the true gift in the box, not money or property, though there were documents enough to rattle Adam if he ever saw them, but evidence of a bond that could not be rewritten by anyone's disdain. The more Adam and Carla tried to press me into the shape of a fragile dependent, the more I felt the stubborn fire inside me grow. Yet I knew I could not show it openly. Not yet. I played the part they expected, nodding, smiling faintly, allowing Carla to remind me to take pills I had already swallowed, thanking Adam when he explained a bill as though I had not balanced household accounts for decades. I let them think I was yielding, because every day I was gathering strength, holding Derek's letters like a shield no one else could see. Still, the erosion continued. Carla began inviting her friends to the house and speaking about me as though I were not present, saying things like, "It's hard, managing an elderly parent. They don't always remember how things are done these days." While I sat silently on the sofa, my hands clasped to keep them from trembling with rage. Adam started to keep the checkbook in his office, and when I asked for it, he said he would handle all financial matters from now on, that I had done enough in my life, that it was time for me to rest. Rest in his mouth meant silence. There were days when I almost began to doubt myself, when the combined weight of their dismissals and the world's quiet agreement pressed so heavily on me that I wondered if perhaps I truly was nothing more than an old woman clinging to scraps of authority. But then I would unlock the little box I kept hidden in my dresser and read Derek's words again, and I would remember the years of strength behind me, the decades of labor and love that no one could erase. I began to take longer walks, telling Adam and Carla that the air helped me sleep. In truth, I was walking to remind myself that my legs still worked, that my lungs still drew breath, that I was not the helpless figure they wished to display. The escalation was not in grand gestures, but in the slow tightening of walls around me, the constant insistence that I was less than I knew myself to be, the theft of my husband's memory piece by piece, the rewriting of my reputation among neighbors, the erasure of my role in the family history. It was a quiet suffocation, one that could almost be mistaken for care, and that was what made it so dangerous. For the world loves a story of children tending to their aging mother, and no one wishes to look too closely at whether the tending is really pruning, cutting, trimming her down until she barely exists. One night I dreamed of Derek sitting at the edge of the bed, holding out the key to me again, his voice calm but insistent. "Don't let them turn you into a ghost while you're still breathing." I woke with tears on my face and a resolve that felt heavier than grief. I could not let this continue. I could not surrender the last of myself to people who spoke of me as if I were already gone. The escalation had reached its peak. I was being erased in increments, but I was still here, and I would have to choose whether to fade quietly or to push back, even if pushing back meant stepping into a storm alone. That choice, I knew, would come soon, and when it did, Derek's key would be the weapon I carried in my hand. The morning I decided to open the rest of the contents from the deposit box was the morning I felt something inside me tilt, as though a weight that had pressed me into silence for years had shifted slightly and allowed a sliver of air into my lungs. I had hidden the documents and letters in the false bottom of my dresser drawer, careful not to let Adam or Carla notice, and for days I had only touched them briefly, running my hands over the envelopes without daring to break the seals, as if waiting for the right moment. That morning, I knew the moment had come, not because of anything dramatic, but because I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror and did not recognize the woman staring back. My shoulders had curled inward, my face seemed blurred by caution, and I thought of how Derek used to lift my chin gently when I doubted myself and tell me that he saw strength in me even when I could not. So I sat on the bed, closed the door firmly, and unwrapped the bundle. Inside were legal documents I did not expect, certificates of partial ownership, records of investments Derek had made quietly years before, and papers that bore not Adam's name but mine, confirming that I still held rights to certain properties Adam had spoken of as if they already belonged solely to him. But beyond the documents, folded with the same care Derek always gave to anything important, was a letter addressed to me in his steady handwriting. I read it slowly, and though my eyes blurred with tears, each word carved itself into me with unmistakable clarity. He wrote that he knew Adam's ambition, that he feared I would be pushed aside, that he wanted me to have something that was not theirs to touch. He told me that the key was not only to the box, but to my own freedom, and that if ever I felt myself fading into the background, I must remember that he had seen me, trusted me, and wanted me to step forward into the light of my own choosing. As I finished the letter, I felt the strangest sensation, as though Derek were in the room with me, not as a ghost, but as a presence reminding me of who I had been before years of compromise dulled me into obedience. For the first time since his death, I did not feel only grief. I felt a kind of summons, a call to reclaim something long buried. That was the shift, the midpoint, where sorrow turned into a kind of resolve, where the erosion of my identity was no longer the inevitable end of my story, but the very reason I had to change its course. I folded the documents carefully and placed them in a folder of my own, one that I could carry if I needed to, and then I put on my coat and walked out into the afternoon. The streets looked different that day, not because they had changed, but because I walked with purpose rather than habit. I passed the bakery on the corner, the one I had not entered since Derek's illness because the smell of fresh bread made me ache with memories of his appetite, and I stepped inside. The girl behind the counter smiled and asked what I wanted, and for once I did not hesitate or apologize for taking up space. I asked for a loaf, paid in cash from my own pocket, and carried it home as though it were a prize. It was such a small thing, but I realized as I tore a piece of that bread in my kitchen and ate it still warm that it had been years since I had chosen something for myself without first considering who else might approve. That evening, when Adam asked where I had been, I told him plainly that I had been out, that I had bought bread, and when he frowned and muttered something about not wandering too far, I looked at him steadily and said that I had lived long enough to know the difference between wandering and walking with intention. He blinked, perhaps startled by the firmness in my tone, and for a moment there was silence that stretched longer than usual, a silence that belonged to me rather than to him. Carla broke it with some remark about dinner, but I had seen it, the flicker of unease in Adam's eyes, the recognition that I was not as pliable as he thought. From that day forward, I began to reclaim small rituals of my own. I opened Derek's letters each morning as though they were prayers, not to mourn, but to remind myself of the strength he believed in. I walked farther each afternoon, sometimes to the library, sometimes to the park, always to places that reminded me I was still part of the world. I began writing again in the old notebook I had kept hidden in a drawer, not lists of chores or expenses, but thoughts, reflections, even anger, because anger too deserved a voice after years of being swallowed. These were not dramatic rebellions, they were quiet shifts, but they began to form a rhythm that felt like life returning. The turning point was not in a single revelation, but in the gradual realization that invisibility is not forced only from outside. It seeps in when you begin to believe the story others tell about you. Adam and Carla had painted me as fragile, dependent, irrelevant, but Derek's key and Derek's words cracked that story open. And through the crack, I saw another possibility, that I could choose differently, that I could live on my own terms, even in the autumn of my years. It would not be easy, I knew that, for confrontation loomed ahead, and Adam's pride would not allow me to step away quietly. But as I sat by the window one evening with Derek's letter on my lap and the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside, I understood that the shift had already occurred. I was no longer waiting for permission to live. I had already begun. It did not take long for Adam to sense the change in me, for sons, no matter how hardened they become, still know the rhythms of their mothers, and even if they do not admit it, they feel the tremors when something shifts beneath the surface. He noticed that I no longer asked permission before leaving the house, that I no longer sat quietly in the corner during their conversations, but allowed my gaze to linger on them until they faltered mid-sentence. It unsettled him, and he reacted not with questions or attempts to understand, but with control, always with control. The escalation began slowly, in the way storms gather long before the first drop of rain. He suggested that I ought not to carry cash because it could be unsafe for someone my age. Then he offered to keep it for me and give me small amounts when I needed them. I declined politely, but the seed of conflict was planted. Next, Carla began bringing up the idea of a professional caregiver. Just for a few hours a week, she said, to give me company and to ease the household burden. Though the truth was, I was the one preparing the meals, folding the laundry, and tidying the spaces they left in chaos. It was their burden that was my presence, not my absence. One evening I overheard Adam on the phone, his voice low but edged with impatience, speaking to someone about medical evaluations, about power of attorney, about ensuring that things were in order before it became complicated. The word struck me like cold water poured down my spine. Power of attorney. In his mind, my independence was already something to be managed, a formality to be stripped away with a few signatures, a few official phrases that would leave me with nothing but the illusion of choice. I sat in the darkness of the hallway, listening to his footsteps pacing the floor, and I understood that he was preparing to tighten his grasp, not only on the property Derek had left, but on me as well, as though I were another asset to be folded neatly into his portfolio. It was around that time that I received the first letter from my grandson, written in his hurried but earnest handwriting, addressed to me, and slipped quietly under my door one morning when Adam and Carla were out. He wrote that he missed me, that he had noticed the way his parents spoke about me, and that he did not believe their stories, that he still saw me as the woman who taught him how to plant tomatoes in the garden, and who once spent an entire afternoon helping him build a birdhouse even though the nails bent and the paint dripped. He told me that he hoped I was all right, and that if I ever needed help, I should write to him directly, not through his parents. The paper trembled in my hands as I read, because it was not only love, it was validation, proof that I was not invisible to everyone, that someone had seen the truth of me despite the fog of Adam and Carla's narrative. That letter became a second kind of key, unlocking in me a fierce determination not to surrender everything I still had. The escalation grew sharper after that. Adam confronted me directly one afternoon, placing a stack of papers on the dining table and explaining in a tone both patronizing and falsely patient that it was time to simplify matters, that all I needed to do was sign, and then he and Carla would be able to take care of everything for me without stress. He called it a gift. He said it would free me, but as I read the legal jargon, my stomach nodded with recognition. It was a transfer of rights, a quiet erasure signed in ink. I slid the papers back toward him and told him I would consider them, and the look on his face, a flicker of anger barely restrained, told me that my refusal was unexpected. Carla tried to smooth it over, placing her hand on his shoulder and telling me gently that of course I didn't have to decide right away, that they only wanted what was best for me. But I could see in her eyes the same hunger that had lived there from the beginning, the hunger for control disguised as care. It was then that I realized Derek's documents were more than relics. They were weapons. I studied them carefully, reading the clauses and the signatures, and I began to understand that Derek had left me enough authority to contest every attempt Adam might make. The knowledge gave me a strange kind of courage. I no longer walked timidly in my own home. When Carla began clearing out Derek's books from the shelves, I stopped her hand and told her that they would stay where they were, that the dust of his fingerprints mattered more than her taste in decor. When Adam raised his voice one evening, accusing me of being unreasonable, I looked him directly in the eyes and said, in the calmest voice I could summon, that I had lived longer than he had been alive and that I was not afraid of him. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that cracks glass. But escalation never comes without retaliation. Adam began to involve outsiders, bringing a financial advisor into the house under the pretense of a friendly consultation. The man, polite and suited, addressed me as though I were already incapable of following numbers, simplifying every word into a childlike tone. He spoke of consolidation, of efficiency, of safety. I listened quietly, let him finish, and then I placed Derek's documents on the table with deliberate care, pointing to my name printed in full as owner, as beneficiary, as the one who could not be written out with a stroke of Adam's pen. The advisor shifted uncomfortably, glanced at Adam, and within minutes the meeting ended. Adam did not speak to me for 2 days after that, his silence thick with resentment. And then came the day when the past returned not as comfort, but as pressure. Carla's face appeared at the doorway of the small cafe I had begun to visit on my walks, a place where I felt briefly like a woman among strangers rather than a relic among kin. She did not enter at first. She stood outside, scanning the menu with a fixed smile, and I knew she had followed me, perhaps even instructed Adam of my whereabouts. When she finally came in, she asked if we could speak privately, her voice low, her eyes calculating. She told me that Adam was worried about me, that my behavior was erratic, that I was hiding things. She urged me to trust them, to hand over the documents I had found, to let them manage the complexity. I listened, sipping my coffee slowly, and when she was done, I told her that if Derek had trusted me with those papers, then no power on earth would convince me to hand them to anyone else. She stiffened, adjusted her coat, and left without finishing her cup. It was after that encounter that Adam's anger reached its peak. One evening he shouted that I was ungrateful, that after all he had done for me, I repaid him with suspicion and resistance, that I was tearing the family apart. His words struck like blows, but I stood my ground. I told him that families are not torn apart by truth. They are torn apart by lies, and that I would no longer participate in the comfortable lie that I was helpless and he was noble. He slammed the door and left, and I sat in the quiet, my hands shaking, but my resolve steadier than it had ever been. The second escalation was not only theirs, it was mine as well. For each step they took to diminish me, I took one to reclaim myself. For every whisper they spread about my supposed confusion, I spoke more clearly in public, to neighbors, to shopkeepers, to anyone who might notice that my words were firm. For every attempt to erase Derek's memory from the house, I placed one of his belongings in plain sight and dared them to remove it. And for every piece of paper they tried to slip in front of me, I produced Derek's letters and reminded myself that he had seen this coming and armed me against it. The storm had fully arrived, no longer gathering at the horizon, but crashing in the rooms of my daily life. I was tested, pressed, cornered, but with each confrontation, I discovered that I was not brittle, that the years of silence had not broken me, only stored my strength for this moment. And though Adam did not yet understand it, though Carla still believed she could outmaneuver me, the truth was already tilting. I was not their dependent. I was the woman Derek had trusted. And the escalation that they thought would crush me was in fact forging me into someone they could no longer control. The day of reckoning arrived, not with thunder or shouts, but with the quiet click of a door closing behind me as I stepped into the lawyer's office once more, this time not as the grieving widow sitting silently at the edge of the table, but as a woman who had gathered her proof, her resolve, and her courage into a single unshakable bundle. Adam had called the meeting, insisting that matters needed to be finalized, that there could be no more delays, that my hesitation was creating confusion. He expected me to shuffle in behind him, to nod and sign where he pointed, to let him steer the narrative. But I walked ahead of him that morning, holding Derek's folder in my hand, and when the lawyer looked up in surprise, it was I who placed the papers on his desk. I who said firmly that today we would be addressing the rights Derek had entrusted to me. Adam's face tightened with the familiar mask of control, his voice calm but lined with steel, as he explained to the lawyer that I was confused, that I had been wandering, that I was clinging to things I did not understand. Carla sat beside him with her polished composure, nodding at the right moments, reinforcing his story without speaking much herself, her silence a weapon sharper than words. But I had come prepared. I opened the folder and laid out Derek's documents, one by one, with my name in ink, with signatures notarized, with dates that stretched back years. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and began to read carefully, his brow furrowing, not with doubt toward me, but with recognition of their validity. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of papers shifting beneath my hand. Adam tried to interrupt, raising his voice, but I did not flinch. I turned to him and said with a steadiness I had never used on him before, "You will not erase me from my own life. Derek trusted me, and I will honor that trust. I am not confused. I am not weak. I am your mother, and I know exactly what I am doing." The words seemed to freeze him in place, as though he had expected every possibility, but not the simple clarity of my refusal. Carla's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in months, perhaps years, I saw them both as smaller than me, their power an illusion that dissolved in the presence of evidence and resolve. The lawyer cleared his throat and confirmed that the documents placed in front of him gave me not only partial ownership of property Adam had claimed as his, but also legal authority over certain accounts that Derek had deliberately left in my care. He explained calmly that nothing could be transferred without my signature, that my role was not ceremonial, but binding. Adam's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscles pulse, his fists clenched against the table, but he could do nothing. The law that he had hoped to wield against me now stood on my side, because Derek had written me into the story in ink that could not be washed away by disdain. And then, with the same calm, I pulled out another document I had prepared with the lawyer's help after my visits to the bank. My own will, newly drafted, freshly signed, altering the legacy that Adam had assumed would fall neatly into his lap. I announced in that quiet office that Adam would not inherit as he expected, that my estate would be divided differently, that the grandson who still saw me, who still remembered the woman who built birdhouses with him, would receive what mattered most. Adam's voice broke then, rising in protest, accusing me of betrayal, of spite, of turning against my own blood. But I looked at him steadily and said that betrayal does not begin with the mother who defends herself. It begins with the son who tries to erase her. There was no shouting from me, no trembling, no apology. The climax was not in noise, but in the stillness of my decision, in the fact that for once in my life I did not bend, I did not smooth over, I did not retreat. I signed the final page with a firm hand, my name etched clearly, as though I were carving it into stone. And when the lawyer placed the documents into a folder and closed it with a decisive snap, I felt something lift from me, a weight I had carried. For decades, the weight of pleasing, of yielding, of hoping that love would be earned through sacrifice. That weight was gone, replaced by the solid, immovable knowledge that I had claimed my own place, that I had stepped fully into the space Derek had left for me. Adam stormed out then, the door rattling behind him, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, like the retreat of a soldier who had lost a battle he never believed he could lose. Carla followed him quickly, her heels clicking, her face pale, no longer composed. I remained seated, my breath slow, my hands still on the table, the silence in the office now mine. The lawyer, perhaps sensing the gravity of what had just unfolded, said quietly that he admired my strength, that not many women in my position would have held their ground so firmly. I nodded, not with pride, but with the calm acceptance of someone who had finally done what had to be done. When I left the office, the air outside felt different, crisper, as though the world itself recognized the shift. I walked slowly, deliberately, each step a confirmation that the decision was irreversible, that the path ahead was mine alone. The climax was not in defeating my son. It was in reclaiming myself, in proving that even at 79 years old, even after years of being silenced and diminished, I could still choose, still act, still draw a line that no one could cross. And as I held Derek's folder close to me, I whispered a quiet thank you to him for the key, for the foresight, for the faith, and for reminding me, even from beyond the grave, that my story was not finished until I chose its ending. In the weeks that followed, the house grew quieter, not with the suffocating silence of being ignored, but with the peaceful hush of a space slowly becoming mine again. Adam and Carla no longer visited often, their absence explained with vague messages about being busy, about giving me space, about how the air was tense and needed clearing. I did not argue. I did not ask them to stay. I did not plead for reconciliation. For too many years I had mistaken proximity for love, endurance for harmony, silence for peace. Now I understood that distance could be a kind of mercy, and that sometimes the most loving thing one can do for oneself is to allow estrangement rather than beg for belonging in a place where one is not respected. I arranged the rooms to reflect my own rhythm, putting Derek's chair by the window where the light was best, restoring his books to the shelves, placing our photograph on the mantel without apology. The house breathed again, and so did I. I moved with deliberate slowness through my days, savoring the rituals that were once invisible under the weight of other people's demands. I brewed coffee in the morning and sat by the window to watch the sun rise, the steam curling into the cold air as I wrote in my notebook. I walked to the park with a steady pace, not hurried, not cautious, but free, and sometimes I stopped to watch children play and remembered when Adam was that small, before pride turned him into a man I could no longer reach. I visited the library and carried books home under my arm like treasures, reading them late into the night with the quiet satisfaction of someone who answers to no one. Freedom at 79 does not look like rebellion or adventure. It looks like being able to choose how you spend each hour without justifying it to anyone else. Letters became my companions, both the ones Derek had left and the ones I began to write. I wrote to my grandson, not long, just pages filled with memory and encouragement, reminding him that kindness was a strength greater than pride, and I mailed them directly, bypassing his parents. His replies came folded in simple envelopes, filled with warmth, filled with questions about my life, about Derek's stories, about our family history. It was not reconciliation with Adam. It was something different. The knowledge that one branch of the tree still reached toward me, that I would not vanish from memory when I was gone. Those exchanges became the threads of a new legacy, not measured in money or property, but in words carried forward. I also wrote a final letter, one not yet sent, addressed to a woman I knew from church who had confided in me her own struggles with children who dismissed her, who rolled their eyes when she spoke, who spoke over her as though she were a background noise. I told her in that letter that invisibility is the cruelest violence because it convinces us we do not exist. And I told her about Derek's key, not as an object, but as a symbol, proof that sometimes the smallest thing held in your palm can remind you of the immensity of your worth. I told her that she must find her own key, whatever form it takes, and that once she finds it, she must never let it go. Perhaps I will give her that letter one day, or perhaps it will be found among my papers after I am gone, but I wanted the words to exist, to travel beyond me. There is no triumph in this ending, no parade, no applause, only a steady calm that feels stronger than any victory. I did not win against my son, because this was never a battle to win or lose. I reclaimed myself from the slow erasure he tried to write over me. I did not heal the wound between us, but I closed the wound within myself that had bled silently for too long. That is enough. That is more than enough. Sometimes at night, when the house is still, and the only sound is the ticking of the clock, I hold the brass key again, its edges worn now from the many times I have turned it over in my hands. I think of Derek, of his foresight, of his love that reached past death, to remind me that I am not a shadow, but a life still burning. I whisper to him that I am all right, that I found the strength he trusted me to find, that I am no longer afraid. And then I place the key back on the small table by my bed, beside the lamp and the notebook, and I turn off the light. The lock it once opened no longer matters, for the true lock was always inside me, and the true opening was the moment I refused to be erased. That is my peace. That is my ending. And if another woman one day finds herself told to sit quietly, to hand over her life, to let others decide for her, then perhaps she will remember my words and hold on to her own key. We are not parasites. We are not burdens. We are not invisible. We are the foundation, and the foundation still stands.